Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Joel Hoffman. Joel is a composer in the European classical tradition. His works draw from a diverse range of sources, including Eastern European folk music, Chinese traditional music, and bebop. He holds degrees from the University of Wales and Juilliard, and has received awards from the MacDowell Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the American Music Center, and others. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities at thedatekeepers.com.
Joel, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us about yourself?
Well, I was born in Vancouver, Canada, many, many years ago. I became a naturalized American when I was 17, but I spent my first 11 years in Vancouver. And I was there because my father was the music director of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. He and my mother were both Americans, but at a very young age, a rather shockingly young age, he was appointed music director of this very fine orchestra in Western Canada. And that's where I was born, and my two brothers and my sister. I was the oldest. I am the oldest. I think maybe the most salient detail to bring up at first is that it isn't just my father who was a musician. My mother also was a really wonderful violin soloist. She played concertos with many orchestras all over the world. And so I grew up in a family where classical music was the most normal thing in the world. And I got interested in it from a ridiculously young age, and so did my two brothers, Gary and Toby, and then my sister, Deborah, and we all became professional musicians. I first was made to play the violin when I was 3. I hated it, but by the time I was 4, I was able to get out of that and turn to the piano, which was a much, much more satisfying thing to do. And it just went on from there. My brother Gary became a really world-famous solo cellist, and my brother Toby is equally fine as a violist and conductor. And my sister, Deborah, was the principal harpist at the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra in New York City for 25 years, before she died at a rather young age, unfortunately. But anyhow, I lived and breathed music, or I guess what people outside of my world call classical music. And this seemed so normal to me that it didn't even seem strange that as a little kid growing up in Vancouver and as a boy, of course, I was expected to go out and play hockey. I wasn't even allowed to have ice skates. I wasn't allowed to do any outdoor sports because I might hurt my hands. And this was just the way things were. We were Jewish living in a non-Jewish neighborhood. So, of course, I pestered my parents for a Christmas tree because all of our neighbors had, and all my little friends had Christmas trees, but we didn't. So it kind of got normal to be not normal. And so, for example, when I was little, I knew that there was other kinds of music besides so-called classical music, but I think I just took on the belief that it wasn't interesting and it wasn't any good. It was a thing to be basically avoided. It wasn't serious. There was something suspicious about it. And of course, my parents were very successful. They did play concerts in front of lots of people in big auditoriums, and so it certainly seemed as though the thing that we were doing was popular. But on the other hand, I was also very aware that there was this other thing called pop music, where the audience was not counted in the hundreds or the thousands, but the 100,000s or even the millions. And this seemed very, very suspect to me. So I knew that there was this thing that was obviously popular all over the world, many different forms of it. But why wasn't the music that we were doing in that same place? Why was it hundreds and thousands instead of hundreds of thousands? And why, when I talked to my little kid friends in Vancouver at the playground, and I would mention Heifetz and Piatigorsky and Rubinstein and Horowitz and Bartók and Stravinsky, that they just just looked at me like, where is this guy from? I mean, they were talking about the famous hockey players in Montreal and Toronto, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like the thing that formed me as a little kid. It's a treasure and it's a curse, because ever since then, I have felt like there's this wall around me and I can never tell whether I constructed it or it was constructed for me. And my life is, in one way, has been kind of peeking out from it and understanding that there's a lot wrong with sitting inside of a little world like this, but there's also a lot that's wonderful about it. I'll say one more thing and then I'll let you ask the next question. I have 2 children, and they're also both professional musicians. They are both married. They're both in their early 30s, and they're married to professional musicians. All of them, I should say, really quite fantastic professional musicians. So this disease is transmitted through multi-generations.
I think we should bring all of you guys on the podcast then. You and your kids.
Well, wait a
their
second.
spouses.
I had a question about this. I mean, it sounds so rosy, but do you ever feel that you were competing with your siblings, or like, do you think your children were competing with each other?
Well, yeah, I'll answer your question by pretending to be a typical psychiatrist. What do you think?
I mean, I asked the question, so...
You asked the question, and I think you already know the answer. It was extremely intense. It still is. But it's a very peculiar form of competitiveness, because there's also an enormous amount of love and support that goes along with it. I mean, when you are brought up in a situation where, at least in one major aspect, because of course there are many other aspects in which my life was totally normal and boring, and that of my brothers and my sister as well, and that of my kids. But in this one respect in which we are somewhere else, off to a side someplace, we also, I think, naturally felt that we needed to support each other because of this weirdness. I mean, of course, I was made fun of all the time when I was a little kid. I mean, why don't you come out and play hockey? And then later, I moved to the United States when I was 11, and I went to high school in Chicago. And of course, I wasn't allowed to play baseball or football or soccer or any of those things either. And why? How come? I mean, what's wrong with you that you can't do these things? And it continued. I have to say that my 2 kids, mainly because of the rather stilted nature of my childhood, I was really bound and determined that they would not be quite as bound up in this hermetically sealed place as I was. So I actually encouraged them to do outdoor sports, and they both got very involved in skiing, for example. And to this day, they are both avid skiers. Whereas if my parents knew that I went skiing ever in my life, they would have been more than upset.
You mentioned that you hated violin, and I remember when I was a kid, I loved drum, but I also hated it because it was too big for me to carry. And I found the solution to carry it on my head, and that made things easier. Was it because it was heavy or big, or the sound, or what did you hate about it?
No, it was the sound. And actually, there is a totally ridiculous thing that I'm going to say, and yet there's a little grain of truth in it. And that is that for all children who either think they want to play a stringed instrument, I'm not talking about guitar, but an instrument that doesn't have frets, such as cello, violin, viola, double bass, there's a fascination for it among some kids. But on the other hand, you very quickly find out that it is dreadfully difficult to play. And not just because you put your left hand on the fingerboard and you don't know where the notes are, or you think you do, but then you play them out of tune, but it's actually much worse with your right hand, with your right arm, because you have very little control over the bow. You make the most horrible sounds. The sounds that you make sound like large and small animals in utter agony. And, and I think even for a prodigy, it takes a good year before they start making a sound that can actually be digestible to the ear. Before that, it is just sheer horror. And the silly thing that I was going to say is there are no real musicians among string players, because how could they tolerate that? I mean, how could they tolerate listening to such an awful thing coming out of the thing that's right under their chin? Whereas
that is a bold statement.
Yeah. Whereas somebody who plays the piano, you put your finger on the note, it sounds great, right? I mean, you don't know anything about what you're doing, but you play a note and it sounds like a note instead of a horrifying sound. And I mean, I think for a lot of people who are attracted to the piano and to other keyboard instruments, the main attraction is you get instant gratification. It may not sound like a lot, but at least it sounds like something. And one of the things that many musicians will say is that the piano is the easiest instrument to start and the hardest instrument to finish. Because, for one, it is a crazy difficult instrument once you get to a significant professional level. And the second thing is that there is an infinite amount of incredibly wonderful music that you can learn. Nobody can live long enough to learn all of the great piano music. Whereas, if you play the trombone, okay, 3 years and you got it all.
Okay, so you've psychoanalyzed the strings, you've psychoanalyzed the keyboard players, so woodwinds?
They're somewhere in the middle. Yeah, I
Percussion?
think, yeah, and the percussion instruments are actually like the piano in the sense that you can make a pretty okay sound on them right away, and of course loud too, which is what kids like. So percussion instruments are great. I'm actually primarily a composer, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. But just as a parenthesis, the traditional Chinese instruments are very, very interesting, especially the oldest string instrument, which is called the qin, which is an instrument that sits on a table and it has just a small number of strings that are stretched horizontally. And you play them a little bit like a harp that's sitting on its side, and you pluck the strings, and it's a very small and delicate sound. And I cannot imagine a child being attracted to this thing because you just don't make much of a splash with it. It's just a very delicate and subtle sort of thing. So, instruments come in every imaginable degree of being appetizing, anywhere from being completely forbidding to being very approachable, like a harmonica. I mean, you can make nice sounds on a harmonica practically immediately. The thing I wanted to say about being a composer is, so we were living in Vancouver, and in the summertime, my father conducted an orchestra in Chicago. They played outdoors in a big park downtown Chicago called Grant Park. And so we went to Chicago every summer, and we stayed with my mother's parents because they happened to live in Chicago. That was kind of a coincidence. And they didn't have a piano. I was practicing the piano at home in Vancouver, but when we went to Chicago, they didn't have a piano. So I had to go to a neighbor's house to play the piano. But even though I loved the piano, I didn't love practicing. I loved the music that I could play when I could finally play it, but I didn't like the work, the effort in learning those pieces. I didn't like reading the music, and I didn't like drilling over and over again to the point where I could play the music well. But what I did love was improvising. I also loved imitating the pieces that I was assigned by my teacher to learn: Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, etc. So when I went over to the neighbor's house, they had a piano, but they weren't musicians at all. They liked music, but they didn't know really anything at all about classical music. And I was sent over there, and I had to practice for a couple hours every day instead of go to the beach in Chicago in the summer. That's what all the other kids did, but I had to go practice. And instead of practicing my Mozart, I imitated Mozart. I was just improvising. I was making sounds, making them up on the spot, enjoying how I could make them sound like Mozart. Or if I want, I can make them sound like Schubert. Or if I want, I can make them sound like Bach. And then, of course, my grandmother would come over and pick me up a couple hours later, and they would ask the neighbors, her friends, well, did little Joel practice? Oh, yes, he practices Brahms and his Bach and his Mozart. I had never practiced those things. I was just improvising. And that's when I realized I was really a composer, because I was much more interested in making up my own notes than learning somebody else's.
Did you imagine that you were outside while you were doing that, or you were satisfied with what you were doing because you were creating your own world?
It was a completely satisfying world to be in. In fact, it was much more satisfying than practicing the piano, because practicing the piano meant being measured by somebody else's standards. In other words, am I playing the scales as fast as my teacher says I need to? Am I playing the Beethoven piece with not just the right notes, but the right expression, the right kind of emotional quality? These were measurable things, because when you're a little kid and you're playing all the same pieces that everybody else is playing, not only are you competing against others, but you're competing against yourself. In other words, am I progressing as fast as I should? Whereas when you're making it all up, there's just no measuring stick. There's no accountability. You're just off in your own world. I didn't miss being out playing in the beach or anywhere else while I was improvising. But for sure, it would have been torture if I actually were being monitored by somebody who could tell whether I was improvising or actually practicing those pieces. That would have been awful.
And what is the path? Because our audience consists of visual artists, writers, people in a variety of disciplines. What does the path to becoming a professional composer look like? What are some of the professional milestones that most composers pass in order to become professional composers? And what are some of the hurdles that you've encountered?
It's actually not that different from being a visual artist or a writer, in the sense that the majority of people, I think, in any country are brought up to believe that the educational system is the filter through which you understand how to develop your craft. And if you rebel against that, if you say, I don't want to go to school, I don't want a teacher, you can develop a great deal of competency. You can develop a great deal of original ideas. In fact, it's easier to do that because you don't have people telling you the way you're supposed to do it. But on the other hand, you also don't have the built-in opportunities that the educational system has. So if you go to a university music department or to a conservatory, well, there are competitive things. And if you win it, then you get this, money, opportunities, maybe some stuff in the media. And it's just like that, of course, with visual artists and writers as well. I think we look for these opportunities because, in a way, they're safe. They're difficult to achieve, and we're constantly competing against ourselves and against others, but at least there's something to measure yourself against, and that's, I wouldn't say comforting, but at least there's a certain reassurance that you're on a path. And okay, so for composers, it's you get into a good school like maybe University of Chicago if you're more interested in the intellectual side of things, or the Juilliard school where you're more interested in the entertainment side of things. And you do your best and you try to flourish and you get a degree or 2 degrees or 3 degrees. And then, if you're a composer, you've either already chosen to go into the commercial world, film, television, music for games, or the pop music world, or if you go into the world of so-called classical music, and I'm qualifying this because there really isn't a good word for the thing that I do. You could call it serious music, but does that mean that other music is not serious? Of course not. You could say art music, but again, same question. You could say unpopular music, which is literally true, but that gives it a spin that's a little bit sad. You could say music that doesn't make any money, which is also true, but that's also a little bit sad. So, there really isn't a good word for it. When somebody asks me, say at a party, like, what do you do? I say, I'm a concert composer, which means I write music that's performed at concerts. But then, so does Taylor Swift. There's just no word for it. But in any case, if you choose to go along this route, whatever it's called, then of course, at some point, in my case, because I lived in a musical family, I knew this even when I was like 10 years old. But most kids who don't have that kind of intensive family background, it doesn't really hit them until, say, the middle of their undergraduate years, or maybe not even until graduate school, that there really isn't any money in it. I mean, there's zero. And so you go into the academic world because that's the only place where you can have a secure income. But then, of course, there's the problem that you have to both teach and you have to get involved in what all of us call administrivia. And, it's draining and it is nothing like composing. And I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, the administrivia is bad, but the teaching isn't necessarily bad. The teaching can be very rewarding. And I did that for 36 years in Cincinnati, which is a very fine school. I had wonderful students. I still am in touch with many, many of them, but it's not the same as composing. So you do need to make that kind of choice. It is possible to make some money as a so-called concert composer, but there's a very interesting problem because the commercial aspect of it then becomes all-encompassing. You have to write music that somebody else is actually going to want to buy, and that means somebody's going to commission you to write it so that you can make your $4.31 an hour if you take the commission fee and, set it out in terms of the number of hours you actually spent doing it. And then there's also a thing called performance rights fees. Every time a piece is played by an orchestra, you get $17 from a thing called ASCAP or BMI, which is a licensing organization. So it's not really a living unless you're willing to live a very, very basic existence. So most of us, myself included, figure out how to be teachers and we get university jobs. And that's considered the best kind of situation because at least you're around music. But I have many composer friends who drive taxis, who are accountants, who play the stock market. Lots of people know that music and math have this sort of weird connection. And so a lot of us are pretty good with numbers. And that means playing the financial markets is actually a possibility. I know, Ito, that because I asked you this, that you found me because I was at MacDowell a number of times.
Yes.
The reason I brought up MacDowell is because there was this one guy. He's a pretty prominent composer. And as you know, it's kind of not done that you spend all of your time during the day in Colony Hall or anywhere else except in your studio. You're supposed to get work done. But the thing is that I'm talking now before cell phones. So he had to have a phone because he was always on the phone with his broker. Buy, sell, buy, sell. And you could hear him, just sitting there next to the telephone telling his broker what to do. And he composed at night because that's when the markets were closed. But during the day, he was making a living.
I hope he has like an opera that it buy, sell. I mean, I feel like you could do something with that.
Yeah. Well, of course, nowadays it's all done so completely differently that I don't think anyone would even understand that. I have to tell you a funny thing, which is mostly off topic, but a little bit interesting to anybody who's been at MacDowell. I live 5 kilometers from the nearest town, and that town only has one traffic light, and it's wonderful. Anyway, the reason I mention this is because I live here because my wife, Heidi, and she, by the way, is also a musician. As I say, there's no escape from this. In any case, we were escaping from New York. We were among the, I think, something like 100,000 COVID escapees from New York, because in March of 2020, there was just nothing to do if you were a musician, literally nothing to do. So we escaped and we were looking for places to go. We came here. We were initially staying with Heidi's brother because he has a farm around here. But then we looked at how beautiful this area was and decided to make the rather drastic move of moving from Manhattan to being in a place where there are a lot of people around here who don't know how to spell Manhattan. And so we were looking at houses, and if we were doing video, I would show you this place and you would gasp, because the front of the house looks like a little colony hall. And there's a studio in the back that looks just like a MacDowell studio.
No way.
And when I saw this place, it didn't occur to me that it looked like MacDowell, which is, I'm sure you both feel exactly the same way. MacDowell is pure magic. There's nothing like it anywhere in the world. And from, I think, almost everybody who goes to MacDowell, if they could live there, they would. And I'm no exception. And when I saw this house, I thought, there's something just right about this place. We need to live here. 2 or 3 months after we moved in, it hit me.
That's crazy.
I somehow didn't make the connection. And then I made the connection and it was obvious. And, you know, one of the things, we don't get much out of being a composer other than whatever personal satisfaction there is in doing it. We certainly don't get any money, and we don't get any recognition or understanding on the part of the general public, because most people just don't have the background or the preparation to really get what we're doing. So at least we can be kind of unique, right? And we can have all these stories and tell everybody else all this stuff because we do live a somewhat different life. But then the other composers live that same different life. So we don't have that much to say to each other, just to everybody else.
Yeah, that's why we started this podcast and why we run it like this, so that people can talk across disciplinary lines.
No, that's a great thing that you're doing. I really appreciate what you're doing. And actually, one of the things that I noticed that bothered me is that composers, myself included, all seemed to be not only interested in what everybody else was doing. So, you know, if there was an open studio, I always went to it. If there was a reading after dinner, I always went to it. I never missed any of those things. And I think that the writers and the visual artists were also more than polite enough to come to the composers' presentations. But I felt very clearly that whereas I'm not a professional writer, but I feel like I have some preparation when I go to an open studio. I don't feel completely out of place. Maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't know that I'm ignorant. What I know is that I feel like I can at least respond without feeling overwhelmed and underprepared. But I can't tell you how many times I would do a presentation, or I'd go to another composer's presentation, and then I'd sit around having a beer with some writers or some visual artists afterwards. And I would say, well, what did you think? And they would say, well, I guess I liked it, but I don't think I know enough to know whether I like it or not. That really bothered me. Why is it that the visual artists and the writers are so much less able to engage with, not the composers as friends and as human beings, but with their work? And so I started a series of articles, and I did a series of interviews with composers, including links so that people, without even leaving the article, could just hit the link and listen to some music. And the composers would be talking about their music, and they would contextualize what they were doing. And that would give the writers and visual artists, who might not know very much about music, but they are creators. And therefore, when another creator, even if it's in a different medium, is talking to them, they get it. They get the idea. They just don't feel like they have the preparation to really engage with it. But on the most important level, they really do. And that's what I was trying to do, is to get them to gain some confidence that they really can do what they think they can't do, that there's a lot more commonality than we think. And, getting back to the pop music versus classical music, there's that too. There is a pop musician called Neil Sedaka who just died. And when he was popular, this was in the early 1960s, he was very, very popular in the United States just before the Beatles. And he was originally trained as a classical pianist. And then he realized that what he really wanted to be was a pop singer, and was extremely successful at it. So I was just watching a YouTube video in which I guess he's about 60 years old at this point, and he's sitting in front of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra of London, and he's playing Clair de Lune of Debussy with an orchestral backup. And you just saw one comment after another that said, I didn't know classical music could be so beautiful.
Yes.
Like it took a pop star to make them understand that they had something to listen to. There was some value in listening to something that they had actually believed their whole life was just entertainment for 19th century aristocracy, which in fact it was.
You mentioned earlier the Chinese traditional music. Have you found other genres that you resonate with or that inform your music now?
Well, actually, I have for a long time. When I was a kid, my brothers and I listened secretly to jazz. I'm talking about 1950s and 60s, the great people like, John Coltrane, et cetera, those kinds of people. So that was a very important early influence. Another influence was Ashkenazi Jewish music, which I didn't grow up with. I'm not a religious person, but my parents' parents on both sides were all from various parts of what at that time was the incipient Soviet Union. And so they brought with them the music and the culture of the Ashkenazi Jews when they immigrated to the United States in the early part of the last century. I always had an affinity for that music as well, and that gets into my concert music. And then, starting about 20 years ago, I got heavily involved in Chinese traditional music. I've spent a lot of time in China. I've been teaching at Chinese universities. I speak Chinese, I read Chinese, and I've written a lot of music for Chinese traditional instruments, including Chinese traditional orchestras of all Chinese instruments. So that's been a big thing for me too. And, it's all the same, whether it's the jazz or the Jewish music or the Chinese music or the Western classical music. It's just gorgeous, gorgeous sound that I love to play with.
When did you first go to China?
My first experience in China was in the year 2000. And I was in Shanghai and Beijing, and that started this long association with the China Conservatory in Beijing and certain musicians who have really appreciated what I've done, and they've commissioned me to write a lot of pieces. I'm actually fairly well known in China because I'm a Westerner who has really embraced the Chinese traditional music. And I'm pretty fluent in it. I know my way around the instruments and around the repertoire. And I actually really care about it. It's amazing music. And it goes back more than 1,000 years in a continuous line with no break. You can look at a piece of music and see how it's evolved since 900 AD, which there was Western music in 900 AD, but compared to the Chinese stuff at that time, it's ridiculously primitive.
What do you wish that more Western composers and musicians knew about Chinese music that you want to share?
I'm not sure how to answer that other than the obvious thing, which is just to listen to it and let it wash over you. The thing about Chinese traditional music that makes it difficult for a lot of Western listeners is that the structures that we attach ourselves to with Western music, whether they're simple like a 3-minute pop song or complex like a 4-movement symphony that lasts 45 minutes, there are still structures that whether we know about them intellectually and whether we're conscious of them or not, they do help give us some time point, some ability to parse the story in some way, akin to paragraphs or chapters in a book. But with Chinese music, a lot of the time it feels like it's pretty, even beautiful, but there's no punctuation. There's no time point differentiation. And so after a while, one just finds one's mind wanders, no matter how attractive or even exotic it is. You lose your place in time and you give up. And that is an illusion because there is structure. It's just a structure that takes a while to kind of figure out. So I guess the thing I would say is if you're at all attracted to the sounds, give it a try. Try not to judge. Don't even worry if you start not caring anymore, but keep the thing on for 15, 20 minutes. And little by little, just like when you're learning a language, a spoken language or a written language, it'll start making sense to you and you'll start getting the way that it is inflected and that contrast is achieved. It isn't the same as a written language, but it has something of the same quality. That is, give it time and it will begin to make sense.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. You create a very nice atmosphere for this. I really appreciate it. And I'm really glad you're doing this.
Thank you for being part of it.
Thank you for being part of it.
Sure.